So, why are toxic relationships so addictive? And why do people with addictive tendencies tend to end up in toxic relationships? Those two things seem to be a little synonymous, really. Like, there's a real overlap between people who pathologically self soothe through drink or drugs or chemicals process, and also those very unhealthy relationships. So the toxic relationship being the relationship where the person's core emotional needs are not met, where there's a lack of trust, where there's gaslighting, lying, cheating, stealing, all those fun stuff. I think we can all agree on 101 of what a toxic relationship is, especially when there's that lying and lack of trust. So why do addiction, and so drinking, drugging, and these ugly toxic relationships go hand in hand? Well, because it's all related to complex childhood trauma. So if we go back to the fundamentals, so why we would self-soothe through a drink or a drug is because in our formative years, in those key years as children, our core emotional needs weren't met. So by either a big T or a little t in terms of trauma. So a big complex trauma being, the death of a parent, sexual abuse, or similar. A little t being where those core emotional needs weren't met. So you weren't, in those early years, you may be shamed, blamed, punished, taught that you weren't worthy of love, that you couldn't be vulnerable, invulnerable. Good children are seen and not heard. These older styles of parenting where we now realize in retrospect were very detrimental to the child's health. While the synapses being pruned in the formative years and the child was understanding who they are in the context of the world, they learned that they're not safe and they're not worthy of love. And then until they look at those pains and they look at that belief system that's formed as a result of those pains, they continue to play those patterns out for the rest of their lives. So many great philosophers have said it, many ways, in many wise ways, and much, much wiser than I. But in terms of how we continue to call these patterns out, keep playing these patterns out and calling them fate until we really look deep inside into what's ruling these things. And a lot of what's ruling these things is these core childhood wounds, and that happened in 0 to 9 is the most significant. 0 to 19 still very, very impactful. What happened in those years? Now sometimes these memories are locked away too. We need to look at ourselves, look at our triggers. There's a lot of work that needs to be done to really understand those core wounds, understand the patterns that are being played out. Look, well, firstly, whenever we see a pattern, we can look at what's the common denominator. Okay, it's me. I must be playing a part in this. If you have one abusive relationship, abuse alcohol once in a blue moon, hey, this is not a problem. But when we're abusing drugs, when we're having toxic, unhealthy relationships, it's a pattern. Why are we being drawn into these relationships? Why are we participating? So we look to our early childhood and what was happening when those core emotional needs weren't met as a child. And one of the things that really happens that is so painful, and I've personally been a part of, and it's impacted my life greatly. And I'll share my personal story here in two ways. Firstly, some of my core emotional needs weren't met. I grew up feeling very alone, very unworthy of love. Now my parents are wonderful people who did the very best they could with what they had at the time. Gorgeous humans, absolute rock stars. They were following this crazy methodology that kids could self-soothe when they were mere babies. My mum was crying on the other side of the door while I was crying it out, because that's what you were supposed to do. So there are lots of things that happen. We're not blaming, we're just talking about what happened and what happens as a result because of the impacts on the psyche and how it plays out. So personally, in terms of my little t's, that meant that I felt very safe, very unsafe, very alone, very unworthy of love. Then it happened, it was a period, and I went through life okay. And then a period of my life happened where the band-aid was ripped off my complex childhood trauma. And I became very, very alone. I'd gone from an environment where I felt like I was very loved and in tribe to then feeling very alone and misunderstood. And that's when I started drinking to self-soothe. And then my body became pathologically addicted. So there really was that physical and psychological addiction to alcohol. If you look at the other videos on really what is alcoholism and what is addiction, the prefrontal cortex is no longer working, the changing in the neurology works, and essentially you lose control. So that was my drinking, was one thing. In terms of I told you I was going to just get it all out there now and share with you. In terms of the toxic behaviors, I have been pulled into the avoidant anxious stance. And that is my part in the fact that I've been in the role of the anxious. So feeling that I felt somewhat safe, but very unloved and unlovable. So I used to seek out love from not the good men who were like, Kylie, I love you, I want to be with you, you're amazing. No, thanks, but no thanks. I'll choose you, the one that I can't trust, the one that keeps abandoning me but then can't live without me and wants me back. Yeah, I'll give it a go with you, So, and it was this dance of the anxious and the avoidant. Now, in this particular case, I'm giving you one example. This person had some very significant childhood abuse. It was all hidden, but he knew that there'd been a period of very significant abuse, and appeared to be very charismatic, very manipulative, very textbook topical, textbook toxic, not narcissist, but narcissistic behaviors in terms of being very charming, very lovable, very seeming like he had it all together, but not under the surface. And that played out in other ways. But in terms of how it played out in terms of toxic relationships, it meant that because there was abuse that was delivered with love from formative years, he associated pain and love together. And when you're too close, too emotionally close, that is dangerous. So cognitively, intentionally, this man with all the best intentions wanted deep, profound, lasting love. But his nervous system did not feel safe when the other person, me in this example, was close to him. Imagine it like two people standing close to each other and one person stands like a little bit too close. You're like, you've got to step back a bit. You feel a bit unsafe. You need to get your level of safety. Now, so what would happen when we got emotionally close is he would push me away, but not having looked at any of his stuff, kind of work out find some logical reason in his brain why. And I have this long list. I've written them down. It was too soon from the last relationship. You were too sensitive. I want to be with someone younger. Lots of all these different reasons. And bless him, I don't carry, there's still a little bit of anger, but most of it I've worked through. I'm angry really that he won't look at those behaviors and how they play out on not just myself, but other women in the world. But really, the thing that's so damaging and also so sad for him was sabotaging his own love life through not looking at those behaviors and sabotaging each of those relationships. Now, the moment he lost me in this example, after normally about 8 weeks, 8 to 12, he'd come back. Me understanding complex trauma and, knowing that we can heal and change and behave, had faith in that. But you've got to want to really change to change. You've got to be committed to being uncomfortable and all of those things that we do when we recover from addictive behaviors. So that's kind of the end of this story, because he wasn't willing to do the work. But you can see how these two things really play out. And in the dance of the anxious and the avoidant, see, I would feel him pulling away and I would rush in to fix it, because to feel safe, I needed to be close. So I would rush in to fix it, to feel safe, he needed to step away. So that would push him away even further. And here we have the dance that actually happens in the short term, but also happens in the long term. This dance of the anxious and the avoidant. And the wonderful thing about the anxious and the avoidant is once you become aware of those patterns and what happened in your childhood, how they're playing out, how it's a nervous system, it's not your logical brain, though your logical brain will give you a reason. I pushed her away for this. I pushed away from him for this. But look at your behaviors, look at the patterns, look at what really makes sense, and then take a deeper look. And that is one of the things that I really want to get across in all of these videos, is that many of us have these pains. And addiction, as I keep saying, sorry, it's probably getting a bit repetitive, is this pathological self-soothing. There's a lot of people in the world who are in a lot of pain, and they are playing that pain out on the world. So please have compassion for the addict, for the alcoholic, for the person in a toxic relationship, but then also at a certain point have self-respect to either not be that person or not stay in that pattern. And I am here to support anyone on the journey of recovering from either.